She had pulled 2 men out of a collapsed field hospital with her bare hands, and never once let her voice shake while she did it. But the night that nearly undid her wasn't overseas. It was in a restaurant on the corner of 5th and 52nd, during a Saturday service that had already gone wrong twice before the appetizers even landed. One second she was balancing a tray of wine glasses. The next, a stranger's hand had closed around her wrist like he had a right to it, and something old and precise woke up in her body. She didn't plan to put him on the floor. She just did. And somewhere in that room, a man in a dark corner booth wasn't gasping like everyone else. He was smiling. If you're already leaning in, stick around till the end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far Juanita's story travels tonight. Saturday nights at the restaurant ran on a kind of controlled chaos that Juanita had learned to move through without thinking, the way she used to move through a checkpoint she'd walked 100 times before. Trays balanced, orders memorized, apologies issued before the customer even finished complaining. She was good at it. She'd had to be. Waitressing didn't pay like the Army had, but it paid on time, and lately that mattered more than anything else. She was on her 4th table of the hour when her phone buzzed once in her apron pocket, and she didn't need to look to know what it was. The dialysis center didn't call to chat. She'd get to it on her break, the same as she always did, the same as she had every Tuesday and Thursday and every other Saturday for the last 8 months, doing the math in her head between orders. $300 for this month's copay, another $400 still owed from March, the transportation fees nobody talked about until the bill arrived. She could hold 2 numbers and a wine order in her head at the same time now. It was almost a skill. Table 11 wants to know if the kitchen's aware they exist, Renata said, sliding past her with a tray of entrees balanced on one palm. On it. She refilled water at table 6, took a dessert order at table 8, and by the time she reached 11 the party of 6 had been sitting long enough that the man at the head of it had worked himself into a low simmer that Juanita recognized on sight. She'd waited on enough tables to know the type before he opened his mouth. The loosened tie, the phone he wouldn't put down, the way the other 5 at the table oriented themselves around him like he was the only weather system in the room. Good evening. I'm Juanita. What can I start you off with? He didn't look up. One of the younger men ordered for the table, and Juanita wrote it all down, brought the drinks, took the food order, absorbed a complaint about the ambient noise near the kitchen door without letting her face change. She'd learned, a long time ago, how to make herself small enough that men like this one barely registered. She was a person and not a function of the room. It used to bother her. Tonight, she didn't have the bandwidth to let it. The branzino came out perfect. She knew it was perfect because she checked herself before carrying it out the way she checked everything twice now. Old habits that had never fully retired, just changed jobs. She set it down with both hands. He looked at it for 4 full seconds. This isn't what I ordered. I can fix that for you right away. I asked for the sauce on the side. Is that so complicated? Or is that above your pay grade tonight? The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet. Everyone aware something had shifted. No one willing to be the one who said so out loud. Juanita took the plate back without a word and walked into the kitchen, where she stood for a second with both palms flat against the steel counter and breathed until the tightness behind her ribs eased enough to move again. In. Out. Pressure was fine. Pressure she knew how to carry. She brought the corrected plate back out, set it down, smiled, and kept moving. She was 3 tables away, writing down someone's dessert order, when his voice climbed just enough to carry across the room. They'll hire anyone these days. No training. No standards left in the city. She didn't turn around. She finished the order in front of her while the couple at that table went very still, listening without wanting to be caught doing it. Sweetheart. The word landed like something thrown, not spoken. Do you actually understand what I'm paying for tonight? Because I really don't think you do. I understand fine, she said level, already turned to go. I'll check back with your table shortly. His hand closed around her wrist before she'd taken a full step. It wasn't a grab exactly. It was the grip of a man who had never once needed to ask permission before stopping someone else from moving. I'm not finished, he said. She would try later to explain what happened the next 2 seconds and fail every time, not because she didn't remember. She remembered all of it, crystal and total, the way she remembered everything from before, but because there was nothing in it to explain. There was no decision. No pause with a woman holding the order pad, consulted the one who'd spent 2 tours learning exactly this. The training simply arrived, whole and immediate, the way it had been built to. Her wrist turned. Her elbow found the leverage on its own. Her free hand landed against the inside of his forearm at the precise point where a grip stops being a choice. And in the space of one heartbeat, his fingers opened, his weight tipped forward, and he was on the floor of the restaurant, staring up at the lights with the look of a man whose entire evening had just been rewritten without his permission. The room went completely silent. Juanita stood over him, weight even, breathing controlled, the order pad still in her free hand, and somewhere behind that silence, she was already bracing for what came next. The manager's name was Devin, and he'd only been running the floor for 6 months, which many still believed that following procedure could protect him from anything. He pulled Juanita into the narrow office behind the coat check. One hand already pressed his forehead, like he could physically hold his composure in place, and didn't bother sitting down. You put a customer on the floor. He grabbed me. I have 4 other people in that dining room who saw a woman throw a man to the ground in front of a table that spends $12,000 a year here. Devin's voice had the brittle calm of someone rehearsing what he'd say to corporate before he'd even finished saying it to her. I have to think about liability. I have to think about what happens if he sues. I can't. Juanita, I can't have this. He put his hands on me first. There were a dozen witnesses to that, too. It doesn't matter. He said it quietly, almost like an apology, which somehow made it worse than if he'd shouted. It doesn't matter who's right. It matters what it costs the restaurant. I need your apron and your badge. She unclipped the badge without arguing. There wasn't a version of this conversation where arguing changed anything, and she learned a long time ago not to spend energy on conversations that were already over. She untied the apron, folded it once, and set it on his desk along with the badge, the 2 small objects that had represented the difference between paying rent and not paying rent for the last year and a half. You're a good server, Devin said, like that might soften it. This isn't personal. It never is, she said and walked out. The dining room had mostly returned to its normal hum by the time she crossed it, though a few tables watched her go with particular attention people reserve for something that briefly threatened to be interesting. Renata caught her eye near the service station, mouthed something that might have been "I'm sorry" or might have been "call me," and Juanita didn't stop long enough to find out which. She pushed through the front doors into a night that had turned colder in the last hour. The rain thinned out to something closer to mist, and stood on the sidewalk for a second just breathing. She still had $4 in change in her pocket from tips before the shift went sideways and no job, and a mother whose next round of treatment was scheduled for Tuesday, whether or not there was money to cover it. She started walking toward the subway, coat pulled tight, already running the numbers again out of habit, even though the numbers had gotten considerably worse in the last 20 minutes. She was half a block down when she noticed a man. He was standing near the mouth of the alley beside the restaurant, not sheltering from the rain so much as simply unbothered by it, hands in the pocket of the coat that fit too well to have come off any rack Juanita had ever shopped from. Mid-40s, maybe. Still, the kind of stillness that made her recalibrate the way she read a street. The same instinct that used to tell her which parked car didn't belong on a block she'd walked 100 times. "You're fast," he said, when she was close enough to hear it, without him raising his voice. Efficient. No wasted motion. That's not something people learn waiting tables. "Do I know you?" "No." He said it simply, without apology, the way some men said things that were obviously true and didn't require softening. "But I watched what happened in there. Most people freeze. You didn't. Most people don't have a reason not to." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, more like the edge of one, filed down to something more careful. "I'm not going to pretend that was a coincidence, me being at that table tonight. I wasn't. I've been looking for someone who does exactly what you just did, and does it without thinking twice." He drew a card from his inside pocket and held it out between 2 fingers. "If you ever want to talk about what that's worth, call the number." She took it more out of reflex than interest. No name, no company, just a number printed in plain, unadorned type on heavy cardstock. The kind of card that costs more to print blank than most cards cost with a logo on them. Who are you? Chris Fox, he said, already turning to go, unbothered by the mist collecting on his shoulders. You'll figure out the rest, or you won't. Either way, you have my number now. He was gone before she could decide whether to ask anything else, folded into the dark the way people only manage when they were used to not being followed. Juanita stood there a moment longer, the card damp between her fingers, and then kept walking toward the subway, because standing still in the cold solved nothing. It wasn't until she was underground, waiting on the platform, that she finally pulled her phone out of her pocket and saw the missed calls stacked on the screen. 3 of them, all from the same number, all within the last 40 minutes, all from the dialysis center. No voicemail, just 3 calls in quick succession, the kind of pattern that never meant good news. She stared at the screen for a second, feeling the night rearrange itself around a second emergency stacked directly on top of the first. And then she called back. The call to the dialysis center lasted 11 minutes, and by the end of it, Juanita understood 2 things clearly. Her mother was fine, stable, resting, nothing acute, but the clinic had received notice that her insurance authorization for Tuesday's treatment had lapsed pending a re-verification that could take anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, and in the meantime, they needed a deposit to hold the slot. $600. By Monday, she checked her banking app standing on the subway platform, already knowing the number before it loaded, the way you know the ending of a story you've read too many times. $41 and change. Rent was due in 9 days. She had exactly 1 asset left that hadn't already been spent, sold, or leveraged. It was sitting in her coat pocket printed on heavy cardstock with no name on it. She didn't call that night. She told herself it was because it was late, because she needed to think, because calling a stranger who'd handed her a business card outside a restaurant she'd just gotten fired from wasn't a decision to make at midnight on 4 hours of sleep. The truth was simpler than that. She was scared of what it meant that she was even considering it. She called the next afternoon, sitting on the edge of her bed with the curtains still drawn, the card balanced on her knee like it might change its answer if she looked at it wrong. He picked up on the second ring. Juanita, not a question. He'd known it would be her. You said to call if I wanted to talk about what last night was worth. I did. So let's talk. There was a pause on the line, brief, unhurried, the kind of silence that belonged to someone who never felt the need to fill dead air just to prove he was still there. There's a diner on 9th, off Chelsea. Open late. Meet me there at 9, and I'll tell you everything I'm willing to tell you tonight. That's not much of a sales pitch. No, he said, it isn't, but it's honest, and you'll find that's rarer than you think. The diner was the kind of place that existed mostly for people who kept irregular hours, cab drivers, night shift nurses, men like Chris Fox, apparently, who could sit in a corner booth at 9 p.m. on a Sunday looking like he belonged nowhere near vinyl seating and fluorescent light, and somehow not seem out of place at all. He'd already ordered coffee for both of them by the time she slid into the booth across from him. I looked into you, he said without preamble. 2 tours. Combat medic training folded into a specialty that doesn't show up cleanly on paper, which tells me more than if it had. Honorable discharge. A brother in, no, a mother on dialysis out of pocket, because the VA doesn't cover family. You've been working 2 jobs on and off for the last year and losing ground on both. Juanita kept her expression flat, the same trick she'd use on 100 difficult tables. You looked into me in less than 24 hours. I have people who are efficient about that sort of thing. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, an idle motion that somehow still looked deliberate. I run a private security and asset protection operation. Corporate clients, private clients, the occasional situation that requires discretion more than paperwork. I need someone who can walk into a room, read every person in it in under 10 seconds, and act without hesitation if the moment calls for it. What you did in that restaurant last night, that's not a skill I can teach. It's either in someone or it isn't. It's in you. What's the pay? He named a number, and for a second Juanita genuinely thought she'd misheard him, because it wasn't a number that made sense for anything she'd ever call a job. It was more than she'd made in the last calendar year combined, and he said the way other people said the time. That's a starting figure, he added, watching her face carefully now. The first time all night, He looked like he was actually gauging reaction instead of simply stating fact. It goes up from there, depending on how things go. What company is this? A holding company. Several, actually. You don't need the names tonight. That's not an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. But I think you have a decision to make by Tuesday that doesn't leave you much room to insist on one right now. She hated that he was right, hated it in the specific, cold way she hated things that were true and inconvenient at the same time. $600 by Monday. $41 in her account. A mother whose life quite literally depended on a machine she couldn't afford to keep running. Without help she had no other source for. When would you need me to start, she asked, and hated herself a little for how steady her voice came out. Like this was simple, like it was just another table she was choosing to take. Tomorrow, Chris said, and slid a second card across the table. An address this time, nothing else. If you're in... She looked at the card for a long moment, then picked it up. The address led to a converted warehouse near the river, the kind of building that had probably been a printing house or a garment factory 100 years ago and had since been scrubbed, gutted, and rebuilt into something with exposed brick and biometric locks that gave no real indication of what actually happened inside. Juanita stood in front of the unmarked steel door for longer than she meant before a woman's voice came through a speaker she hadn't noticed and told her to come up. The elevator opened directly into a floor that looked, at first glance, like any well-funded office. Long tables, monitors, a wall of glass overlooking the water. It took her about 90 seconds to clock that the resemblance ended there. Nobody was dressed like corporate security. Nobody moved like corporate security. There was a stillness to the room, an economy of motion in the 6 or 7 people scattered across it that she recognized from exactly one other place in her life. And it was an office. "You're early," Chris said, crossing the floor toward her without the coffee shop stillness from the night before. Here, he moved like a man on his own ground, which was different from moving like a man who owned it, though it took her a moment to place the distinction. "Good. Come meet the floor." The introductions came fast and clipped. A logistics coordinator named Priya, who barely looked up from 3 monitors. 2 men near the far wall who were introduced only as Reyes and Kellerman, and who nodded at her the way you'd nod at a delivery, polite and brief and entirely uninterested. And then there was a woman by the window, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back tight, arms crossed in a way that wasn't casual so much as loaded, who Chris introduced simply as Dana, my second, and who looked at Juanita with an expression that had already made up its mind about something. "The waitress," Dana said. "Not unkind exactly. Just flat, assessing. The way you'd size up a variable that had been introduced into an equation without your approval." "Juanita," Chris corrected, mild. "I know what he told me." Dana's eyes stayed on Juanita a beat too long before she turned back to whatever was on her screen. "Welcome to the floor." It wasn't hostile enough to call an insult, but it wasn't far off either, and Juanita filed away the same way she'd have filed a customer's tone on a bad night. Information, not injury. She'd worked rooms full of people who didn't want her there before. She knew how to hold ground without making a fight. Chris walked her through the rest of it briskly. Badge, access tiers, a floor she wasn't clear for yet, a training schedule that started the next morning at 6. He was fluent and specific about logistics and almost entirely opaque about everything underneath them. When she asked what kind of clients the operation actually served, he gave her 3 industries in a tone that sounded rehearsed. When she asked why a security company needed biometric locks and a room full of people who moved like they'd been trained somewhere other than a security certification course, he told her that was a conversation for later, once she'd been read further in. She let it go for now. $600 had already cleared the dialysis center that morning. Wired the same night, she'd signed whatever paperwork Priya had put in front of her, no questions asked about where it came from or how fast. That kind of speed bought a certain amount of her patience. Not all of it, but enough to get through the first day without pushing. It was close to 11 that night. Most of the floor emptied out. When Chris found her still at one of the long tables reviewing training material she only half understood, and sat down across from her without being asked. "You have questions," he said. "I have a list." "Ask one." She considered which one mattered most. "Dana doesn't trust me. Dana doesn't trust anyone for the first 6 months. It's not personal. It's how she stayed alive this long. He said it plainly, without softening it, and something in the phrasing snagged in Juanita's mind. Stayed alive, not kept her job, not lasted in the industry. She didn't say anything, just waited, and after a moment he continued, quieter now. There's a man named Salvatore Ruiz. He runs an operation that used to respect certain lines with mine. He stopped respecting them. In the last year, he's taken 2 accounts that were mine to protect, and he's done in ways that suggest he has help from somewhere close to me. That's the actual reason the floor looks the way it does. That's the actual reason I needed someone like you. You said this was corporate security. It is, Chris said. It's just not only that. He held her gaze, steady, not asking for forgiveness of the omission, just letting the truth sit there between them. I'll tell you more when I trust you know how to carry it. Tonight, I wanted you to at least know the name. Juanita turned the name over once in her mind. Salvatore Ruiz, and understood with a kind of cold clarity that felt disturbingly familiar, that whatever she walked into, it was already bigger than a paycheck. 3 weeks in, Juanita had stopped thinking of the floor as unfamiliar territory and started thinking of it the way she used to think of patrol route, a place whose rhythms she was learning well enough to notice when something in them went wrong. She'd been cleared into the second access tier by then, enough to see scheduling, personnel movement, and the shape of the jobs the floor actually ran, though still not enough, Chris had made clear, to see everything. It was a schedule that snagged her attention first. In the unglamorous way most real problems announce themselves. Not with a siren, but with a number that didn't quite add up. She'd been asked to help Priya reconcile shift logs against a client escort job that had gone sideways 2 nights earlier. Nothing catastrophic. A handoff that had run into unexpected resistance at a warehouse near the container terminals. Resolved without anyone getting hurt, but resolved messily, in a way that suggested the other side hadn't been surprised to see Chris's people there. Juanita's task was simple. Confirm who'd known the route and the timing in advance, and when. The list should have been short. Route confirmation had gone out 4 hours before the job, to 5 names. Standard procedure Priya had explained to her the first week. But when Juanita cross-referenced the access logs, who'd actually opened that particular file, and when she found a 6th touch, a login at 11:47 the night before, nearly 16 hours ahead of the official briefing, under credentials that belonged to someone on the approved list, but at a time that didn't match anything on that person's known schedule. She almost dismissed it. People worked odd hours here. Nothing about a midnight login was inherently strange on a floor that never fully powered down. But something about the timing tugged at her the way an inconsistency in a patient's vitals used to, not dramatic enough to act on immediately, but wrong enough not to ignore. So she started keeping a list of her own, off the official system, handwritten in a notebook she kept in her bag instead of at her workstation. Every job that had gone sideways in the last 2 months, cross-reference against who had access to the details beforehand, and when they'd looked at them. It took her 4 nights, working after the floor cleared out, to build something that resembled a pattern instead of a coincidence. For incidents, for early logins, each 1 hours ahead of when the information should have been needed, each one under credentials belonging to someone with legitimate reason to be in that file, which was almost worse, because it meant whoever was doing this wasn't hacking anything. They already had the access. They were just using it earlier than they should have, and in a way that lined up every single time, with Ruiz's people showing up somewhere they shouldn't have been able to predict. She thought about telling Dana first, testing the theory on someone close to the ground, but Dana's guardedness toward her hadn't thawed much in 3 weeks, and Juanita didn't yet know which side of this pattern Dana might fall on if it came to that. She thought about telling Priya, who'd helped her pull half these logs without asking too many questions. But in the end, she decided this went to Chris directly, because he was the only person on the floor she was reasonably sure hadn't been the one making those midnight logins. She found him in his office past 11, the rest of the floor down to its usual skeleton crew, and set the notebook on his desk without preamble. For incidents in the last 2 months, all of them the other side seemed to know about too early. All 4 times, someone accessed the relevant file hours before they had any operational reason to. Chris didn't reach for the notebook right away. He looked at it, and then at her, with an expression she was starting to recognize as the one he wore when he was recalculating something faster than his face let on. Whose credentials? Different each time. That's what makes it hard to pin down. Whoever's doing this has broad access, or they're borrowing it. You built this yourself. I didn't like the alternative, which was doing nothing. He was quiet for a moment, turning the notebook a quarter inch on the desk without opening it, the same idle, deliberate motion she remembered from the diner. You understand what you're telling me. If this pattern is real, it means someone inside this floor has been feeding Ruiz information for at least 2 months, and I've been sitting 3 feet from them the whole time without knowing it. I understand. I need you to keep going, he said finally, quietly. Don't take this to anyone else on the floor. Not Dana, not Priya, not anyone, no matter how much you trust them individually. If I'm wrong about who this is, I'd rather be wrong in private than have half the floor watching each other before I know who to actually watch. And if you're not wrong, Chris's expression didn't change, but something behind it went very still. Then we'll deal with that when we know for certain, not before. Juanita nodded, took the notebook back, and left him sitting there in the half-dark of his office, the weight of what she just handed him settling over the room long after she'd gone. Her mother called her Thursday afternoon, mid-shift on the floor, which was unusual enough on its own that Juanita stepped out of the training room to take it before she'd even heard the first word. There was a man here today, her mother said, and her voice had the careful, deliberately calm quality Juanita recognized from childhood, the tone her mother used when she decided not to sound scared and hadn't quite managed it. During my treatment, he sat down next to me in the waiting area, very polite, said he was a friend of yours, asked how I was feeling, asked if you'd mentioned your new job. Juanita's stomach dropped in a slow, cold way that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with certainty. What did he look like? I don't know. Honey, an ordinary man. Gray jacket. He wasn't unkind. That's what was strange about it. He knew things he shouldn't have known. He knew what time my appointment was before I told him. He knew I'd take the 4:15 bus home. He said it like he was making conversation, but it didn't feel like conversation. Did he touch you? Threaten you? No, nothing like that. A pause, and then quieter, he just said to tell you he stopped by and that he hoped things were going well at your new job. Juanita, what is this job? It's fine, Mom. I'll handle it. She heard how thin the reassurance sounded even as she said it, and hated that there wasn't a truer version available to offer instead. She didn't remember most of the walk from the training room to Chris's office. She remembered the door was closed, and she opened it anyway, and Dana was in there with him going over something on a monitor, and Juanita didn't care. I need a minute, Juanita said, in a voice that made clear it wasn't a request. Dana looked between them, read something in Juanita's face that made her decide not to argue, and left without a word, closing the door behind her. A man visited my mother's dialysis clinic today, Juanita said, before Chris could speak. Sat down next to her, knew her appointment time, knew her bus route home, told her he was a friend of mine. She's 71 years old and hooked to a machine 4 hours a day, and someone walked into that room to remind me they could reach her whenever they wanted to. Chris's expression didn't shift the way she expected it to. No surprise, which told her almost as much as an actual answer would have. Sit down. I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me what I actually agreed to work for. Sit down, Juanita. Not sharp, just final. The tone of a man who understood this conversation had been coming and had simply run out of ways to delay it. She sat, arms crossed, every muscle still coiled from the walk over. The holding company, Chris said, isn't a fiction exactly. It's a structure. Underneath, it is an organization that's operated in this city for 3 generations, mine included. We move money, we move product, we protect people who pay us to be protected. And we do it outside the reach of the systems most people rely on for that. I told you it was corporate security because it's the truest lie I could offer you on day one. What it actually is organized crime. I run it. Ruiz runs a rival version of it. And what happened to your mother today is Ruiz telling me, through her, that he knows exactly who you are to me now, and that he's willing to use that. The room went very quiet. Juanita had spent 3 tours learning how to sit still with information that rearranged the ground under her, and she used every bit of that training now, because the alternative was letting the fury and the fear currently fighting for space in her chest win outright. You let me walk into this blind. I let you walk into a job that saved your mother's treatment, paid your rent, and gave you something you were good at, Chris said. And for the first time since she'd known him, there was something almost like regret in it, though not quite an apology. I didn't tell you the whole truth, because I needed to know you'd stay long enough to matter before you had a reason to leave. That was a calculation, and I own it. But I never lied about what you were walking into being dangerous. I told you the first night that this was worth more than a normal security job pays. You don't get paid what I pay you for something safe. She's not part of this. She never agreed to be part of this. I know. He said it plainly, without deflecting it. And I'm telling you now, completely, because you need to understand the actual size of what's in front of you before you decide whether you're staying. Ruiz doesn't fight fair, and he's just shown you he's willing to go for the people you love to get to me. If you walk away tonight, I'll make sure she's protected regardless. But if you stay, you need to know exactly what you're staying for. Juanita sat with that for a long moment, the anger in her chest cooling into something harder and more useful. The same transformation she remembered from every moment in her life that had demanded she stop feeling something and start doing something instead. Tell me everything, she said. All of it. Starting now. The plan Chris laid out was simple in concept and required a kind of patience Juanita hadn't fully appreciated until she was living inside it. They would seed a piece of false information into Floor's normal channels, a fabricated shipment route, plausible enough to pass as real, restricted to a small enough circle that if Ruiz's people acted on it, the leak would be traceable to whoever had touched the file. 5 people get access, Chris said the night they built it. You, me, Priya, Dana, and Reyes. If Ruiz shows up where the fake route says he will, we know it came from one of those 5. And Priya and I both trust our own hands on this, which narrows it considerably. Juanita didn't say Dana's name out loud, but she knew he was thinking it too. The math had been narrowing toward Dana for a week now, ever since Juanita cross-referenced the midnight logins against everyone's actual known schedules and found that 3 of the 4 suspicious touches lined up loosely but consistently, with windows when Dana had told the Floor she was off-site running personal errands. It wasn't proof. It was a pattern, and patterns weren't verdicts. But it was enough that when Chris built the access list of the false shipment, Juanita noticed he'd built it specifically so Dana's name would be on it, and so with 3 others whose alibis were already accounted for. The fake file went live on a Tuesday. It described a shipment, cash and product moving between 2 of Chris's holdings, routed through a warehouse 2 blocks from the container terminals. Time for a Thursday night. It was detailed enough to be worth acting on and wrong in every particular that mattered, a route no real shipment would ever actually take, chosen because it led to a stretch of waterfront that was fully covered by 2 of Chris's own people and a set of cameras nobody outside the Floor knew existed. Juanita spent Thursday feeling particular, familiar tightness of waiting for something you set in motion to either confirm or collapse everything you believe. She was on the floor at 8 that night, when Reyes radioed in from the waterfront, voice flat, and controlled in the way people trained to stay flat, and controlled sounded when something had actually happened. We've got movement. 2 vehicles for men converging on the warehouse exactly like the file said they would. Chris was already moving toward the door before the transmission finished. Juanita went with him, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that this confirmed the leak was real and said nothing yet about who'd caused it. They took Ruiz as men without much resistance. For men expecting an empty warehouse and a quiet handoff, walking instead into 6 of Chris's people who'd had 2 full days to prepare. It was over in minutes, efficient and mostly bloodless. The kind of operation Juanita recognized from a different life entirely, and she found herself, oddly, more useful in the aftermath than the confrontation itself. Calm under pressure, directing 2 of the younger men through securing the scene while Chris and Reyes dealt with the men on the ground. The real answer came an hour later, back on the floor, when Priya pulled the access logs from the fake file and found exactly 1 touch outside the expected 5, a login at 6:40 that evening, 90 minutes before the file's contents would have needed to leave the building to reach Ruiz as people in time act on it. The credentials belonged to Dana. Chris didn't raise his voice when he confronted her. That was, Juanita thought later, somehow worse than if he had. He simply laid the log on the table between them, in the small back office where he'd taken her the moment she walked onto the floor that night and waited. Dana looked at the printout for a long time before she looked up. Whatever calculation she was running behind her eyes finished fast, the way it does for people who spent their whole careers knowing exactly how these conversations end. "He has my sister," she said finally, flat, stripped of anything Juanita could call an excuse, even though it clearly wasn't offered as one. "Ruiz. 2 years now. He found out what she owed and bought the debt before I even knew it existed, and he's been using it since. I didn't want this. I want you to understand that. I never wanted this." "How much has he gotten?" Chris asked. His voice was even controlled, but Juanita could see the cost of that control in the set of his jaw. "Enough. Routes, timing, personnel movement. Not everything. I kept some of it back, whatever I could without him noticing." Dana's hands were flat on the table now, steady despite everything. "He's planning something bigger than the warehouse tonight. That was never the real target. It was a test, to see if I'd still deliver for him, even with new people on the floor." Her eyes flicked once, briefly, to Juanita. "He's after the Fulton Street account. The whole shipment cycle, not one route. The entire operation. Time for the transfer window at the end of the month. If that goes through, it takes out almost everything you've got left that Ruiz doesn't already control." Chris's expression didn't change, but something in the room did, the temperature of it shifting toward whatever came next. "Fulton Street," he repeated quietly, and Juanita understood, watching his face, that they had just moved from defending against Ruiz to something considerably more dangerous. Dana didn't leave the floor in handcuffs, and she didn't leave in a way Juanita ever asked Chris to explain in detail. What she understood was that Dana's sister had been quietly extracted from whatever leverage Ruiz thought he still held, that Dana herself was gone from the floor by the following morning, and that Chris had made a decision about how to handle a woman who betrayed him under duress that he clearly wasn't going to discuss further. Juanita didn't push. There were parts of this world she was still learning the shape of, and she decided for now to trust that Chris drew his line somewhere she could live with, even if she couldn't see exactly where. What mattered more in the days that followed was Fulton Street. He'll have expected Dana to go dark eventually. Chris said the four of them gathered around the long table on the floor. Himself, Juanita, Priya, and Reyes, the small circle that now knew the full shape of things. People like Ruiz build in redundancy. He won't panic just because one source stopped delivering, but he'll be hungry for a replacement, and hungrier still if he thinks the replacement is offering him something better than Dana ever did. "You want to feed him a new source," Juanita said. "I want to feed him you." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence in the warehouse, different from the silence in Chris's office the night Dana confessed. This silence had weight to it, the specific gravity of a plan that asked something real the person was aimed at. "Explain it," Juanita said, because she wasn't going to agree to anything she didn't fully understand first, a habit that kept her alive in places considerably less forgiving than this one. Chris laid out with the same clip precision he used for everything operational. Ruiz didn't know Juanita by more than reputation yet. The waitress who dropped a man cold in a restaurant, absorbed into Chris's operation shortly after, still knew enough on the floor that Ruiz's intelligence on her would be thin. That thinness was the opening. If she made contact with the right channel, presenting herself as disgruntled, underpaid relative to what she'd been promised, resentful of how fast she'd been thrown into danger she hadn't signed up for, a story close enough to true that she wouldn't have to work hard to sell it, Ruiz would have every reason to believe she was exactly the kind of asset he was looking to cultivate. "He'll want to meet in person eventually," Chris said. "Men like Ruiz don't trust anything they can't look at directly. That's the opening we need. Once he agrees to a face-to-face, we control the location, the timing, and what he walks into. And if he figures out it's a setup before that happens, then it's dangerous," Chris said, without softening it. "I won't pretend otherwise. This isn't a controlled environment like the warehouse. This is you, alone, in a room with a man who has killed people for considerably less than what we're asking him to believe about you." Juanita sat with that for a moment, turning it the way she used to turn a triage decision in the field, weighing risk against necessity with a particular clarity she only found under real pressure. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, careful and frightened. She thought about the man in the gray jacket, sitting down next to her at the clinic like it was nothing. She thought about how tired she was of being the person things happened to instead of the person who decided what happened next. "I'll do it," she said. "Tell me what I need to know." They built the approach over following 2 days. A burner line, a contact routed through a low-level fixer Priya, had identified as connected to Ruiz's outer circle. A cover story rehearsed until Juanita could deliver it without a single hesitation in her voice, because hesitation was the one thing that would get her killed faster than any wrong word. Reyes drilled her on Ruiz's known associates, his habits. The 2 restaurants he was known to favor for meetings he considered sensitive. Chris drilled her on exit routes, on what to do if the meeting went wrong in the first 30 seconds versus what to do if it went wrong after 10 minutes. On the earpiece she wore that would keep her connected to a van 2 blocks away, without ever being visible. The bait went out on a Thursday, an unremarkable message through an unremarkable channel. A woman claiming inside access to Chris's operation, unhappy, underpaid, willing to talk for the right price. Ruiz's people took less than 6 hours to respond. He wanted proof of good faith first, a small piece of real information to confirm she was who she claimed to be, which Chris authorized to give, low value, verifiable, expendable. 2 days after that, the fixer came back with a location and a time. A private room at a restaurant Ruiz favored on the Upper East Side, Friday night. Just the 2 of them, no one else at the table. Juanita read the message twice, then looked up at Chris, who was watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize as his particular version of worry. Controlled, contained, but present. "Friday," she said. "He's taken the bait." Then Friday, Chris said, "We make sure he never sees a hook." The restaurant Ruiz favored had the kind of quiet, understated wealth that made Juanita think of Table 11 from another life entirely. Low light, careful service. The sense that everyone in the room had paid a great deal of money to be seen not trying too hard. She was shown to the private room at exactly 9, alone, the earpiece tucked discreetly enough that even a careful pat-down wouldn't have found it, though she was betting Ruiz's vanity would keep him from ordering one at all. He was already seated when she walked in, older than she'd expected from the file photos, silver the temples in a way that read as deliberate rather than natural, watching her cross the room with the unhurried attention of a man who enjoyed believing he could read people accurately before they'd said a word. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I was starting to wonder if you'd lose your nerve." "I don't lose my nerve." She sat, hands folded on the table, exactly as rehearsed, exactly as calm as 4 years of learning to make herself small had trained her to be. "I lose patience with being underpaid for work that gets me followed home. That's different." Ruiz smiled, the expression of a man who believed he was witnessing greed dressed up as grievance, which was precisely what she needed him to believe. "Tell me what you have." She gave him the second piece, slightly more valuable than the first, still carefully bounded, a detail about scheduling that would read as significant without actually costing Chris anything real. Ruiz listened with the stillness of a predator confirming a scent, occasionally asking a question sharp enough to test her, and every time she answered without the smallest hesitation, watching his confidence in her thicken like something physical settling into the room. She was 3 minutes into stringing him along toward the next piece, the part where she needed to keep him talking long enough for the van 2 blocks away to finish what it needed to finish. When her earpiece delivered the 2 words she'd been waiting for the entire meeting. "We're in." Reyes and 2 others had spent the last 90 minutes working their way into a storage unit Ruiz kept under a shell company 2 blocks from the restaurant, a location Dana had given up in her confession as a place Ruiz kept the physical ledgers he refused to trust to anything digital. The actual accounting of every account he'd stolen, every debt he'd leveraged, every operation he ran outside whatever legitimate business fronted for it. It was, Chris had explained, the one piece of evidence that wouldn't just embarrass Ruiz. It would end him, handed to the people above him who cared far less about loyalty than they cared about a man who becomes sloppy enough to get caught. Juanita needed exactly 4 more minutes to be sure the extraction was clean. "You're hesitating," Ruiz said, watching her with the first flicker of real suspicion she'd seen all night. "Why?" "Because the next piece is the one that actually matters, and I want to know what you're offering before I hand you something that gets me killed if it traces back." She let her voice roughen slightly, frustration bleeding through the calm, exactly the crack a woman genuinely negotiating from fear would show. "You think I don't know what happens to people who talk?" I need to know this is worth it. It worked or worked long enough. Ruiz leaned into the reassurance, into performance of a man convincing a nervous asset she'd made the right choice. And Juanita let him talk, nodding at the right moments, watching the clock behind his shoulder without ever letting her eyes settle on it too long. The earpiece delivered the second signal 4 minutes and 30 seconds later. Clear. We have everything. Juanita didn't need to stay another second after that, and every instinct she'd carried out of 2 combat tours told her to end this exactly the way she'd been trained to end anything once the objective was secured. Clean, fast, no unnecessary exposure. She excused herself with a line about needing air, about needing to think it over, and Ruiz let her go with the easy confidence of a man who believed he'd already won her. He wouldn't know how wrong that was until the following morning, when the ledgers reached the people who backed him, and the men who protected him for a decade decided, almost overnight, that Salvatore Ruiz had become a liability they could no longer afford to shield. 2 weeks after that, his operation had folded in on itself entirely, assets seized by people with far more authority than Chris had ever needed to claim, his territory absorbed or abandoned, his name spoken, when it was spoken at all, as a cautionary tale. Juanita's mother's treatment was never at risk again. Chris made certain of it before Juanita even had to ask. Quietly and without ceremony, in the way she was learning was simply how he did things that mattered to him. She found him on the floor one evening in late autumn, the city going gold and cold outside the windows, and told him what she'd been turning over for days. "I'm staying," she said, "not because I need the money anymore. I don't, not the way I did. I'm staying because I'm good at this, and I'm tired pretending I'm not." Chris studied her for a long moment, something unguarded moving across his face for the first time since the night he'd handed her a card with no name on it. "Then stay as my equal," he said. "Not staff. Partner." Juanita held out her hand, and he took it, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like she was making herself small at all.